metto qui allora.
Sì.
Sì.
Ora sì. Ora siamo a dopo.
Once more.
Sì, grazie. Anche
Buonasera e benvenuti al Pontificio Istituto Orientale per la presentazione del libro Eastern Catholic Theology in Action, Essays in Liturgy, Ecclesiology and Ecumenism, pubblicato da Catholic University of America Press, il primo volume in una nuova collana sulle chiese orientali cattoliche intitolata Eastern Catholic Studies and Texts. Infatti è la prima collana dedicata alla teologia contemporanea delle chiese orientali cattoliche nel mondo anglofono. Our book panel this evening will draw attention to the distinctive theological voice of Eastern Catholics. This book also pays homage to a pioneering voice and promoter of Eastern Catholic theology in the West, the Very Reverend Professor Peter Galadza, and the work of the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute of Eastern Christian Studies in the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto in Canada. Vorrei presentarmi. Sono Laura Ieraci, editrice di One, la rivista dell'Associazione per il benessere del vicino Oriente, oppure Catholic Near East Welfare Association, un'organizzazione papale fondata da Papa Pio XI nel 1926 per sostenere il ministero pastorale e caritatevole delle chiese orientali nei loro paesi di origine. L'incarico dell'Associazione per il benessere del vicino Oriente, Catholic Near East Welfare Association, include anche la Pontificia Missione per la Palestina in Medio Oriente. As a papal organization mandated to promote greater knowledge and appreciation for the East within the Catholic Communion, Catholic Near East Welfare Association is pleased to co-sponsor today's book presentation, a significant intellectual and pastoral initiative for our Eastern Catholic churches. Sono contenta di accogliervi da parte del Pio, dal Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute e dell'Associazione per il benessere del vicino Oriente e ringrazio a tutti voi oggi per la vostra presenza, including our brothers and sisters joining us on the live stream. Forse avete già notato, però vorrei sottolineare lo stesso che questa presentazione bilingue si svolgerà coerentemente in English and in italiano, cioè without traduzione simultanea, che va bene per un gruppo così. And so with this, iniziamo. Oggi siamo lieti di avere con noi per questa presentazione uno degli editori e 3 studiosi che hanno contribuito al volume per discutere i temi e gli obiettivi di questo lavoro, un progetto di ricerca, di scrittura che ha richiesto più di 3 anni. Ognuno di loro avrà un momento per condividere le proprie idee, riflessioni e intuizioni. La domanda chiave della nostra conversazione stasera: chi sono le chiese orientali cattoliche e quali testimonianze contribuiscono dalla loro esperienza vissuta, storicamente travagliata, e dalla loro prospettiva che sorge dalle loro fonti teologiche? Si può rispondere a questa domanda facendo ricorso alla sociologia, si può anche ricorrere alle questioni dell'identità, ma queste risposte risulterebbero del tutto superficiali. I nostri relatori dal Canada, gli Stati Uniti e l'Italia sono venuti per rispondere a questa domanda e per discutere i temi maggiori che sorgono dal presente volume, un volume che collega contributi da 17 studiosi internazionali, interconfessionali ed interdisciplinari. The themes of this book, Eastern Catholic Theology in Action, Essays in Liturgy, Ecclesiology, and Ecumenism, are at the heart of the common mission of supporting our Eastern Catholic churches, shared by the Pontifical Oriental Institute, Catholic Near East Welfare Association, and the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute, where this book project began. I have the pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists this evening, who each contributed a chapter to the book within their areas of expertise. I will introduce them in the order in which they will present their insights. The Reverend Andrew Summerson is co-editor of Early Eastern Catholic Theology in Action, the book under discussion today. Father Summerson is assistant professor of Greek patristics and Eastern Christian studies at the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute. He is a Byzantine Catholic priest of the Ruthenian Byzantine Eparchy of Parma in the United States and pastor of St. Mary Byzantine Catholic Church in Whiting, Indiana. He studied theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University and holds a doctorate in patristic theology from the Pontifical Patristic Institute Augustinianum. He is the author of several journal articles and of the book Divine Scripture and Human Emotion in Maximus the Confessor, Exegesis of the Human Heart, published by Brill in 2021, and a scholar fellow of the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. The Reverend Basilio Petra is professor of fundamental moral theology and of the ethics of marriage and family at the Theological School of Central Italy in Florence, where he recently served as faculty president. Father Petra also teaches at the Pontifical Oriental Institute and the Pontifical Alphonsian Academy in Rome. He holds a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Florence and a doctorate in theology from the Pontifical Lateran University. He is the author of numerous articles and of more than 20 books in Italian, largely on contemporary theology, including Amoris Laetitiae, Accompagnare, Discernere e Integrare la Fragilità, as well as Preti sposati per la volontà di Dio, Saggio su una chiesa a 2 polmoni, and I limiti dell'innocenza, il peccato involontario nel pensiero cattolico e nella tradizione orientale. He has also served as a consultant to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith since 2024. Father Petra has indicated that he may need to leave early to make another commitment, and we sincerely appreciate his ability to be with us this evening, even if for only a short time. The Reverend Alexander Lastruk is Executive Director of the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute and Judicial Vicar of the Toronto Regional Tribunal, which serves 7 dioceses in Ontario, Canada. He is also Judicial Vicar of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Eparchy of Toronto and Eastern Canada, for which he was ordained. Father Lastruk completed his doctorate in canon law at St. Paul University in Ottawa, Canada. He is a recognized expert in canonical trials and is regularly sought out to conduct penal and contentious matters across North America. He also offers expert witness on civil matters facing dioceses in the Canadian courts. He teaches Eastern Canon Law and Procedural Law in Toronto, Ottawa, and Washington, D.C., and provides continuing education to regional groups of canonists. He is the editor of Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian studies. His research interests include ecclesiology, procedural law, penal law, and sacramental law. Deacon Daniel Galadza is a deacon of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Archieparchy of Kyiv and professor of Eastern Christian liturgy at the Pontifical Oriental Institute. Previously, he worked as assistant professor in the Department for Historical Theology at the University of Vienna and as a lecturer at the University of Toronto and at Ukrainian Catholic University. He continues to serve as a member of the Vienna Ecologia Project of the Austrian Academy of Sciences and as a member of the Special Liturgical Commission of the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches. A graduate of the University of Toronto, the Sheptytsky Institute, and the Pontifical Oriental Institute, Deacon Galadza's research primarily focuses on the historical development of liturgy, particularly the Byzantine Rite, as well as modern and contemporary Orthodox and Eastern Catholic worship and church singing. He is the author of the book Liturgy and Byzantinization in Jerusalem, published by Oxford Press in 2018. Dopo questi interventi risponderanno il professore Thomas Cotoy, William and Barbara Moran Chair in Early Christian Theology and Interreligious Relations presso la Pontificia Università di San Tommaso d'Aquino, l'Angelicum, e Sua Eccellenza Arcivescovo Michel Jalac, l'attuale segretario del Dicastero per le Chiese Orientali. Dopodiché ci sarà una discussione tra i relatori e tempo per le domande da parte di tutti i presenti. Iniziamo allora con l'intervento del coeditore del libro, padre Andrew Summerson. Prego.
Grazie Laura. Innanzitutto voglio ringraziare tutti i nostri collaboratori che hanno messo in atto questo evento, soprattutto Canelva, che sponsorizza questo evento, sia l'Istituto Orientale che ci ha abbracciato con una grande ospitalità, il Dicastero per le Chiese Orientali, nella persona di Sua Eccellenza Michel Jalac, che darà una risposta. Voglio fare due cose. Oggi parlo un po' della genesi di questo libro che è stato fondato proprio dall'esperienza delle chiese orientali cattolici nell'Ovest, proprio nell'America del Nord, e poi voglio parlare un po' della testimonianza teologica dei orientali cattolici che possiamo dare sia a livello globale, a livello ecumenico, e forse c'è al mondo che ha bisogno di Dio. Okay? So, when Deacon Daniel and I started to talk about this text, it really just thought we would do a special volume within Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian studies, and I thought that was a really terrible idea because we could do something better. His father, Father Peter Galadza, together with his colleague, Father Andriy Chirovsky, have energized the work of the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute through the posing of one simple question: what is Eastern Catholic theology? You would think this would be an easy question to answer. However, these pioneers had few, if any, resources to put resolve to their search. They certainly had very little help from the institutional church, who, despite being resource-rich in content, refuses to develop the institutional infrastructure to provide the space to pursue these questions. We have evidence of this quite early in the church in North America. In the early part of the 20th century, the papal delegate, precursor to a nuncio to the United States, Fumasoni Biondi, lamented the lack of ministries in the Eastern Catholic churches in the U.S. in comparison with the Latin Rite. And I quote, "In contrast with the vigorous religious life of the Latin Church, there is almost the complete unproductivity of the Eastern Catholic element. No schools, no institutions, basta. the continued scarcity of intellectual culture in the Eastern Catholic churches has had the side effect of reducing right to its minimum. If such anemia goes untreated, it proves catastrophic for the body of Christ, who requires the vigor of its own culture to flow through its veins and exercise the work entrusted to her apostles to make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This book pays homage to the work of somebody who went against the grain of the complete apathy of developing this institutional infrastructure, Father Peter Galazza. Indefatigable is not the right word, because he's broken his body, together with his colleague, Father Andriy Chirovsky, in fatigue for the Eastern Catholic theological cause. Vain are not his labors, because the Lord builds the house, and many mansions have we in the future for exploring Eastern Catholic theology. A testament to the fidelity of this one encourager of Eastern Catholic theology, this volume opens up an entire series, Eastern Catholic Texts and Studies, which, as Laura mentioned, was the only volume series in the English-speaking world dedicated to this kind of reflection. That this work pays homage, Eastern Catholic Theology in Action, to Father Peter Galazza at the Sheptytsky Institute, it shows us that this lives past the fever dream of the founders of the Institute, who want to answer first-order questions about the nature of Eastern Catholic theology by exploring Eastern Catholic theologians praying and living in their native habitat, between the altar and the aula, the stacks of the library and the services, so that the sacrifice of mind might bring about true logiki latria. The book that opens the Eastern Catholic Studies and Texts is this book, and it's organized around themes found in the Code of Canons for the Eastern Churches, who defines the particular characteristics of a ritual tradition or church. Each has, quote, a liturgical, theological, spiritual, and disciplinary patrimony, culture, and circumstances of history of a distinct people by which its own manner of living the faith is manifested in each church sui juris, end quote. This volume offers a chance to see a variety of Eastern Catholic voices, as well as Roman Catholic, as well as Orthodox appreciators of the Eastern Catholic theological heritage in action on the page. That's why we wanted in this volume to deliberately avoid, to the extent possible, self-conscious reflection on identity issues. Instead, we wanted to privilege the voices of practitioners, liturgical theologians who crack open history, ritual, and tradition to render intelligible and attractive the liturgical and ascetical itinerary that promises union with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We asked of historical theologians to demonstrate the vitality of the sources so close at hand to Eastern Catholics. Athanasius has much to say to the new atheism. Origen has much to say to the experience of martyrdom in the Eastern Catholic churches in the 20th century, which occurred at an unprecedented scale in the history of Christianity. And St. Ephrem has much to say to restore wonder to the heart of the practice of the theological enterprise itself. We called upon practicing canon lawyers right here in front of us, who thrive in providing the necessary temporal care for the church, as well as historians who sort through history to find the coordinates that can map this contemporary experience within a wider context. As the first volume in this series, the book makes no claim to have all the answers. Rather, it hosts a set of conversations with authors who do not always agree. Va bene. These are precisely the kind of tensions to be leaned into and not away from in theological discourse. Smashing all these authors together in one book produces a number of healthy tensions between authors, which is what we want to do with this book, with this series. We want to start conversations, not end them. Ecclesiological and administrative tensions immediately come to mind. We have some real fine reflections by David Fagerberg. He opens the volume, and he gives a very eloquent theological and spiritual vision that draws from the Code of Canon of Eastern churches. Who knew it could be a spiritual text, Alex? I didn't know that. Description of the essential characteristics of a particular ritual tradition. On the other hand, Alex Laschuk points out the very practical restrictions that the Code of Canons of the Eastern churches puts on the flourishing of the Eastern churches, particularly in the diaspora. Another polarity we see regards the role of the Holy See in the life of the Eastern Catholic churches. Former Secretary of the Dicastery of the Eastern churches, Archbishop George Gallardo, explains how the liturgical instruction for applying the Code of Canons of the Eastern churches allows for the positive restoration of the liturgical life of Eastern Catholics. However, Stefano Parenti, another contributor, he really highlights the limitations of the Holy See's attempts at liturgical reform in the Eastern Catholic churches. It lacked uneven scholarly rigor and without really any clear reference to the living body of Orthodox Christians with whom we share the same worship. In a similar vein, Basilio Petra, here presente, demonstrates the Vatican's failure to comprehend what it means to have Eastern Christians within the wider Catholic communion, as evidenced by some incoherent presentations of their perspectives at the highest levels of the Church's magisterium. All of these ecclesiological difficulties flow from a more substantial tension that the book highlights, namely, the role that history plays in framing the very possibility of Eastern Catholic theology. At the conclusion of the volume, Father Andrew Louth, a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church, provides a very sympathetic response from an Orthodox perspective to conclude. He argues that the pre-modern liturgical heritage binds together Eastern Catholics with Eastern Orthodox theologically. He describes this feature as an experience of worship developed prior to modernity without concern for modernity, which celebrates the privileged words of the past embedded in worship. For this reason, Louth sees Eastern Catholics as allies in the same investment to explore a shared pre-modern theological heritage. Allow me, as Father Andrew the Younger, to agree with Father Louth. By profession, a priest who celebrates the Byzantine liturgy myself, and a historical theologian who works primarily between the 3rd and 8th century, I share it. The value of the Eastern Catholic perspective is that it has to be seriously, self-consciously historical. It requires attention to the complex theological, historical, and political matrix that prompts the genesis of Eastern Catholics. It also privileges the constellation of sources embedded in the liturgical, ascetical, and theological tradition that demand a certain historical consciousness to engage with any degree of responsibility. For the diligent student of history immediately encounters differences in time, place, cultural assumptions, and argumentation. These all demand the necessity to think otherwise than with the tools provided for us by the tyranny of the present. So one reason that we can't ignore these authors is due to the fact that the patristic past is not simply just a group of authors upon whom we rely. An Eastern Catholic theologian is more than a historian of ideas, but rather a curator of theological expressions that are embedded in worship and shared by a people. Without engaging them as privileged sources, we risk silencing the very means by which we can understand this primary Christian context. In worship, we're regularly confronted by an immediate friction. In a prayer experience, me as a Byzantine Christian, that's drawn primarily from the past, it provides a more immediate and intimate space to break bread with the dead, that is, communion with the saints. In the dynamic that happens when a postmodern worshiper steps into the pre-modern, it provides an environment where the seams between past and present, not to speak of heaven and earth, can be distinctly felt. In the absence of historical consciousness and an unfamiliarity with the basic authors that give life to this liturgical traditions, these seams are imperceptible and the grammar remains a foreign language. However, an attentive student who allows history as their teacher gives the sporting chance that Eastern Catholic theologians can live their vocations. And it's a vocation that I think Father Peter, Father Andrei, and all of these great founders at the Sheptytsky Institute, and we're so indebted to the work of the Oriental Institute for so many years, where despite the fact that in many of the countries of origin, Eastern churches were beleaguered by civil war, foreign invasion, oppression by ideological totalitarian regimes, that sort of reflection can still flourish. And it allows to do what an Eastern Catholic theologian is meant to do. And that is to offer an epiclesis. What do I mean by that? To offer to the horizon of our experience as Eastern Catholics, quotidian and boring, banal as it may seem, the epiclesis of our questions. And when we do that as responsible theologians, you'll see the crack where the light gets in. It allows us to expose and capacitate imaginations wide enough to receive the heavens that bow down for the salvation of the human race. Thank you.
Padre Petrà, prego.
Dunque, io parlerò in italiano e ho pensato di dirvi principalmente come è nato questo testo e anche il tipo di riflessione che è legata al testo che troverete nel libro. E cioè, praticamente è nato da alcune constatazioni. Ci sono stati, dopo la elezione di Papa Francesco, ci sono stati 2 sinodi sulla famiglia. E nel sinodi sulla famiglia sono stati invitati tutti, più o meno tutti quanti, rappresentanti dei vari strati della Chiesa. I riti erano presenti i diaconi, erano presenti uomini coniugati, erano presenti rappresentanti di tutti gli stati di vita, grosso modo, e i vari livelli della Chiesa. C'era anche un prete orientale, celibe. L'unico invitato era un prete celibe. È una cosa che mi sorprese molto, perché stranamente i preti uxorati orientali e le loro famiglie erano totalmente assenti. Non erano per niente previsti. E durante i sinodi vennero fuori diverse cose sui social, vennero fuori anche diversi interventi pubblici che sottolinearono questo aspetto. E qualche risultato venne ottenuto, perché poi nella Moris Laetitia venne aggiunta una frase alla conclusione di un numero che io cito, tutto quanto, venne aggiunto un riferimento al fatto che poteva essere utile in alcune circostanze anche sentire l'esperienza dei preti sposati. Fu il risultato di quella specie di parlottio, diciamo così, digitale che venne fuori dopo che qualcuno mise in evidenza come i preti sposati della Chiesa Cattolica erano totalmente assenti. In un sinodo che parlava della famiglia, che convocava tutte le presenze cattoliche, i vari strati, i vari livelli. A dire la verità, anche i diaconi erano presenti in un certo modo. Per esempio, erano presenti i diaconi sposati, però non come coppia. Capitava che ci fossero anche il diacono con la moglie, ma perché combinavano le cose per altri fattori, ma non perché erano sposati. In modo, al di là di questo, io di lì ho ripreso in mano un'osservazione fatta anche in precedenza, ed è che praticamente la mentalità dominante ancora nell'attività teologica e anche pastorale della curia romana, per dirla così, della Chiesa di Roma, l'identità fra condizione latina e condizione cattolica è pacificamente assunta. Questa cosa mi è stata anche confermata successivamente da altri elementi, per esempio il Sinodo dei Giovani del 2018, internazionale, mondiale, non una cosa fatta in parrocchia, a livello mondiale, in cui si parla appunto della vocazione. Si dice giovani, la fede e il discernimento vocazionale. Sentite, a un certo punto si dice come vivere la buona notizia del Vangelo e rispondere alla chiamata che il Signore rivolge a tutti coloro a cui si fa incontro attraverso il matrimonio, il ministero ordinato, la vita consacrata. Cioè, in pratica, secondo questa posizione del documento, la posizione generale, la tripartizione vocazionale è questa: il matrimonio, il ministero ordinato, la vita consacrata. E il matrimonio uxorato, cioè scusate, il presbiterato uxorato. Non si parla neanche del diaconato uxorato, che pure viene attualmente nella condizione latina, non si parla per niente. Cioè tutto viene costruito anche a livello pastorale, in questo caso specificamente la pastorale vocazionale, prescindendo dalla cattolicità della Chiesa. Perché nella cattolicità della Chiesa c'è anche la vocazione al presbiterato uxorato, ad esempio. Cioè questa tripartizione non è una tripartizione cattolica, ma è latina, fondamentalmente. E anzi, dopo la restituzione o lo stabilimento del diaconato uxorato nella tradizione latina, non è più neanche pienamente latino, è un latino un po' arcaico. Naturalmente uno potrebbe dire, ma è un documento sinodale così, rivolto ai laici e tutto il resto, forse tanta precisione non era necessaria, anche perché poteva creare confusione, è meglio distinguere le cose in modo netto, forse. Però sono rimasto anche molto colpito dal fatto che la ratio fundamentalis institutionis sacerdotalis del 2016, che parla del dono della vocazione sacerdotale, per quanto riguarda il clero sposato, rinvia alle singole chiese orientali. Notate, è un documento in cui si parla della vocazione sacerdotale nella Chiesa cattolica, in tutta la Chiesa cattolica. Si dà l'interpretazione cattolica della vocazione sacerdotale, del dono della vocazione sacerdotale, e per quanto riguarda il clero uxorato si rinvia alla formazione delle singole chiese orientali. Un paragrafo, neanche un paragrafo, 3 righe. 3 righe. Poi il resto è tutto cattolico. Ovviamente è un cattolico strano, perché una parte significativa del presbiterato cattolico non è presente, non è considerato, non è preso sul serio. In altre parole, perché un documento cattolico deve parlare soltanto agli ambiti vocazionali presbiterali latini e non a quelli orientali? Per quale motivo? Non c'è motivo. Deve presentare, si può capire la difficoltà. La difficoltà è che la stessa teologia, il pensiero teologico riguardo alla vocazione sacerdotale e ovviamente anche le conclusioni pastorali, è una visione fondata sul fatto che la posizione latina è quella giusta e ancora oggi si mantiene in certi livelli della curia romana, probabilmente, l'idea che il presbiterato uxorato orientale è una sorta di concessione alla debolezza dell'uomo, ai limiti dell'uomo. Conviene che sia così, ma non ha un significato teologico in senso vero, perché in rapporto alla vocazione c'entra male, non si riesce a collocarla, non c'è un'adeguata posizione teologica del sacerdozio uxorato. Per cui in qualche modo il sacerdozio uxorato c'è, non può non esserci, a questo punto specialmente non può non esserci, ma è bene non parlarne troppo, o perlomeno se ne parla molto là dove è dominante, dove è quindi nei luoghi tradizionali del cristianesimo orientale e anche magari in certe comunità consistenti orientali che possono essere fuori dei luoghi tradizionali. Questo significa anche non soltanto un problema riguardo alla percezione del presbiterato uxorato, ma significa anche scarsa attenzione alla dignità della esperienza orientale e la teologia orientale. Bisogna dire la verità, che in Oriente non si è molto sviluppata, per quanto mi risulta, almeno ci sono delle cose, ma non si è, una vera e propria teologia del ministero uxorato non esiste adeguatamente, solo frammenti, ma non esiste una vera e propria teologia. Per cui di fronte all'immenso lavoro teologico fatto per sostenere, difendere e promuovere il celibato sacerdotale, la riflessione teologica sul presbiterato uxorato fa la parte della Cenerentola, non c'è granché. Qualche volta ho avuto l'impressione, parlando in vari contesti orientali, che quasi anche gli orientali abbiano difficoltà a presentarsi come preti sposati, qualche volta, specialmente quando sono in contesti latini, cosa che a me ha sempre fatto uno strano effetto. In modo, devo dire che il mio testo è stato scritto in rapporto a questi tempi. Qualcosa sta cambiando? Sì, mi pare di sì. Mi pare che stia cambiando qualcosa perché sta maturando una considerazione maggiore del ruolo delle chiese orientali e della loro presenza, quindi anche della loro dignità. Lo si vede in alcune ultime cose che vi ricordo brevemente, ad esempio nella relazione di sintesi del 2023 al termine della prima sessione del Sinodo dei Vescovi, dell'Assemblea ordinaria del Sinodo dei Vescovi, praticamente in 2 punti propositivi si dice, si invita a formare una commissione congiunta di teologi, storici e canonisti orientali e latini per studiare le questioni che richiedono approfondimento e avanzare proposte per proseguire il cammino. Guardate che è la prima volta che si fa un organismo del genere con parità, diciamo così, rappresentativa. Ancora si dice, nei dicasteri della Curia Romana ci sia un'adeguata rappresentanza di membri delle chiese orientali cattoliche per arricchire la Chiesa intera con il contributo alla loro prospettiva, favorire la soluzione dei problemi rilevati e partecipare al dialogo ai diversi livelli, nei dicasteri della Curia Romana. Cioè, nei dicasteri della Curia Romana bisogna cominciare a avere la presenza orientale che in qualche modo aiuti a fare da curia romana una curia cattolica e non semplicemente una curia romana. Una curia cattolica, cioè che è al servizio della Chiesa cattolica. Dicevo prima, qualcosa è aumentato. Non sorprende che dei 10 gruppi di studio costituiti per volontà di Papa Francesco nel marzo 2024 su alcune questioni emerse nella prima sessione della 16ª Assemblea Generale, il primo gruppo sia alcuni aspetti delle relazioni tra le chiese orientali cattoliche e la Chiesa latina, composto equamente di 14 membri, metà orientali e metà latini. Bisogna dire che è un bel passo avanti, un bel passo avanti questo. Il documento finale della 16ª Assemblea Sinodale, tenutasi in seconda sessione nell'ottobre del 2024, intitolata Per una Chiesa Sinodale, Comunione e Partecipazione in Missione, stampato nel dicembre scorso. Vi sono vari punti nei quali si sottolinea l'attenzione alla presenza delle chiese orientali. Io non mi fermo più di tanto, però nel numero 72 si ricordano formalmente che anche i preti sposati orientali fanno parte del presbiterio delle diocesi a pieno titolo. C'era bisogno di ricordarlo, evidentemente. E per la loro parte anch'essi aiutano il clero locale ad aprirsi agli orizzonti della Chiesa intera, cioè rendono ancora più cattolico il clero locale. Al numero 135 in particolare si dice una cosa assai rilevante secondo me. Dice questo: prima di pubblicare documenti normativi importanti, i dicasteri sono esortati ad avviare una consultazione delle conferenze episcopali e degli organismi corrispondenti delle chiese orientali. È una cosa bellissima questa. Si dice prima di pubblicare documenti normativi importanti. È molto bella, un grandissimo passo avanti. Uno si può chiedere naturalmente quali sono i documenti normativi importanti e quali sono i documenti normativi non importanti. È una questione un po' complicata, certamente, ma però non voglio insistere su questo, perché però voi capite che se si vuole portare avanti questa cosa in modo serio, inevitabilmente si comincia a affrontare anche la problematica, per esempio, della pastorale delle vocazioni. Non si può avere più la stessa pastorale delle vocazioni. Cioè io non posso, nella pastorale delle vocazioni, parlare del clero cattolico celibe come se fosse il tutto del clero cattolico. Dovrò partire e presentare la vocazione del clero cattolico secondo due direzioni, due possibilità. Cioè il Signore chiama al clero, alla vita celibe, e il Signore chiede alla vita uxorata i suoi ministri. Ma il Signore, e forza, che altra possibilità c'è? Se si vuole essere coerenti con la totalità dell'esistenza cattolica oggi e del ministero cattolico oggi. Ma qui inizia tutto un altro discorso, naturalmente. Però prendiamo atto che almeno c'è stato una serie di passi avanti notevoli che hanno, secondo me, dato nuovo senso alla presenza delle chiese orientali nella comunione cattolica. E non è davvero poco, ecco. Scusate se vi ho preso del tempo.
Grazie, Padre Petra. Grazie. Adesso ascoltiamo l'intervento del padre Alex Laschuk.
Thank you for having me here today. I will speak in English. The chapter that I wrote in the book was one of a few that discussed the reality of being Eastern Catholics in the context of the West, specifically in North America, where we have really had immigration from traditionally Eastern countries since the end of the 19th century that has gone through very different phases, different theological and juridic phases. And even when we see how the church was established, the churches were established in the United States and in Canada, they were established very differently. Sorter Ortinsky, who was first appointed in the United States, followed the old norms that we really had from way back of Etsi Pastoralis, where he had delegated jurisdiction from the Latin ordinaries, whereas Nikita Budka in 1912 is appointed with personal jurisdiction. He has jurisdiction over his subjects, which is a big change that's not solely something Eastern, that there was a factor there, but also different thinking in the Roman Curia that was happening with the revision of the 1917 Code. But the reality that happened in Canada, which was very unique and was really responded to by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky in his early visits to Canada, was the massive numbers of Eastern Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics specifically at the time, who were becoming what we would have called at the time schismatics, like huge numbers who were joining the Moscow Patriarchal missions or other missions and leaving the Catholic Church. And it was that very obvious awareness that kind of broke the resistance in the French hierarchy at the time to giving these Eastern, generally farmers in Western Canada, giving them access to their own pastors. And much of that was coordinated by their pastors in the home country, by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky and others, who would send missionaries, especially religious priests, or sometimes Canadian priests. There are some great examples of French-Canadian priests who went and learned in Belgium and in other countries, learned to minister to these faithful in North America. So going from that time, a century ago, to today, where we have in the United States 10 Eastern jurisdictions, in Canada 7 Eastern jurisdictions, and there are 3 jurisdictions that are for both the United States and Canada. For example, the Romanian Eparchy of Canton that is in both countries. We have a very different situation with a lot of structures, going from a time with nothing to a time with a lot of structures. But at the same time, a lot of challenges. And so we could see that in Canada, for example, while we have 7 eparchies that are Eastern Catholic, that's 7 chanceries that we need to pay for, and 7 seminaries, or at least access to a seminary for 7 eparchies. Canon lawyers, liturgy talks are great, but canon lawyers keep the lights on, right? So my interest is always, how do we pay the hydro bill, right? How do we keep the lights on? How do we keep the church open? And there are challenges when we establish these structures in the West. In Toronto, we're lucky. We have 3 Byzantine Catholic day schools that are part of the government-funded Catholic school system. So they are fully Catholic schools that are available to our Eastern Catholic students. That's not something that exists in other jurisdictions, and we're lucky because of the unique historical role the Catholic faith has had in Canada that's different from other countries. But we have this reality where Eastern Catholics outside the territory are in this situation where you're a member of this church. Remember, a church sui juris has a theological, a liturgical, a canonical, and a historical aspect, right? That's how we define it traditionally. But the synod in Ukraine or in Lebanon or wherever it might be, really only has jurisdiction over one of those aspects in the West, right? The liturgical. And while we sometimes will have, and often have, in fact, a voluntary connection to that, that's not always the case, right? And sometimes we have some pretty interesting situations that will develop in the West where we don't have these same maybe levels of accountability that would exist in the patriarchal territory, the traditional territory, for better or worse. There is that basic pastoral challenge when you have an eparchy whether in Canada. Canada's big. If you've not been to Canada, travel's expensive. It's a very big country. It's about 7 hours to fly one side to the other, you know. I remember when Bishop Brian in Toronto was appointed administrator, the synod asked him, how long is the drive from Saskatoon to Toronto? And he said, it's a 4-hour flight, right? You can't drive that in a day. And that was right before COVID, which of course made everything more complicated. But when you're a pastor whose neighboring parish maybe is 1,000 kilometers away or 2,000 kilometers away, it's a different reality for how you minister to your faithful. A reality where you have to give them a reason to drive past the 10 or 20 Latin parishes that they're going to drive past to come to your church, right? And that's a real pastoral challenge. Even in Toronto, where we might have many options for Eastern Catholic churches, in Toronto, but 52% of people who live in Toronto are not born in Canada. So it's a very diverse city. Even the Latin Archdiocese has Mass in 32 languages. And then there's Eastern eparchies on top of that. Almost every Eastern church is in Toronto. So there's a lot of variety. But how do you get your faithful to come to your church, right? How do you get them to want to be there to encounter Jesus Christ? And, you know, it's more than just swinging the incenser, right? That's a start, of course, but we need to have a lot more involved in our parishes to have that encounter with Jesus Christ. And this really impacts every way that we find ourselves as being Eastern Christians in the West. And so when we are, you know, Eastern Catholics outside the territory, you know, all these questions like what is the role of particular law, fasting, days of obligation, you know, how does all this play out in our life? And it plays out very differently, of course, if your bishop is very eager to follow the norms of the synod, or if maybe he's not so eager, right? Or even the individual pastor sometimes. We can have a lot of different things that happen. And much of this really relies, in Canada especially, on the support that we've thankfully had for really a century, financial support especially, but the moral support that comes from our brothers and sisters in the Latin parishes who have in many ways funded our Eastern Catholic parishes through different projects. We have a group called Catholic Missions in Canada that provides really serious funding for 2 of our eparchies, and other groups. With the war, we've had many communities. They all come to Toronto, but they can't afford to stay in Toronto, right? They'll come to New York, but they can't stay there. So they'll go to places like Newfoundland or Nebraska where there are no Eastern Christians, right? So how do we get a priest to them once a month when a plane ticket might be $2,000 return, right? And those are things that are really only made possible by the support of our Latin brothers who really need to, if they want to support it, need to believe in the importance of supporting the Eastern churches, which is something that thankfully is there, but of course is not a guarantee. I recently looked at some numbers because one question would be, well, why does all of this matter, right? Why should we even care about this? Now, I hope, speaking at the Oriental Institute, we would agree that supporting the Eastern churches is an important thing. But we have to recognize the assimilation factor that faces the Eastern Catholic churches once they are outside their traditional territories. I looked up some numbers recently, and just some historical numbers. The Archieparchy of Winnipeg in 1949 had 107,000 Ukrainian Catholics. This decade, it is 3,000. So from 107,000 to 3,000. The Slovak Eparchy in 1990, 30,000 Catholics and 21 parishes. Now it's 3,800 in 4 parishes. Archieparchy of Philadelphia, 1950, 302,000. Recently, 12,479. Pittsburgh, 1949, 299,000. In 2022, they reported 19,000. The Maronites, 152,000 Catholics in 1976. That's 24,000 in 2022. Eparchy, Edmonton, Ukrainian Catholic, 1950, 310,000. In 2021, 5,000. Right? Those are complete implosions of something that clearly didn't work over the last century. And as we see more and more Eastern Christians come from their traditional territories, often because of war, how are we going to do something different that didn't work over the last century, right? Where we have lost these entire generations of faithful, where we just continue doing the same thing and will probably happen again, right? That's not going to be effective. And when we talk about Eastern Christians, for example, the Chaldeans and other groups who are existing in smaller and smaller numbers in their home territories, if we're not able to preserve these churches in the West, it will mean the end of the church, right? Because there's no one left in Iraq or in Syria or wherever they were, because they've all come here. There is this reminder we have, it's an Unitatis Redintegratio, right, of course, but the importance of the diversity of the church that contributes to the church's splendor, and finding a way to support that in the context of North America is really, I think, the question to support the Eastern Catholic churches in this century, to see that they're in a fragile situation where they're in an overwhelmingly Latin world, and sometimes a Latin church that doesn't know how to integrate them, that doesn't know how to support them, to offer them the supports they need so that they can keep that tradition. John Paul II in Sacre Canonis has that great line that I'm told he stole from Father Zuzek about, that our church sui juris being implanted on us in our mother's womb, right? That special connection between us and our church sui juris that can just disappear sometimes if we do not foster that existence. So we look for those ways that we can do that, and I think this book is an important topic, an important point of discussion for how we're doing well, but also what can we improve on.
Thank you, Father Alex.
I think it's on time.
And now, Deacon Daniel.
Yes, thank you. From the bad side of the good news, canon law, to the joy of liturgy. Today's book presentation for me is a moment filled with joy, but also with one aspect of sadness. Let me explain. It is a joy for me to see this book on Eastern Catholic theology published as the first volume of the series Eastern Catholic Studies and Texts, and dedicated to Father Peter Galazza, not only because I am on the editorial board of this new series from CUA Press, edited by Father Yuri Avakumov, or because I am a contributor to the volume with a chapter on a question dear to my heart, or because it provides an updated answer to the question of what is Eastern Catholic theology that was posed in 1995 as the topic of a panel, which I attended as a nerdy teenager with nothing better to do on a Saturday morning. And the panel at that time included speakers like Father Robert Taft, who graced it with his colorful metaphors in proper Cranston, Rhode Island pronunciation, and the publication of the papers in Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian Studies, in 1998, that included a paper by our dear Father Edward Farrugia, present here, or because I have known Father Peter Galazza my whole life. He is, after all, my father. It is a personal joy for all of these reasons. From a scholarly perspective, it is a particular joy to read the first 4 chapters of this book, written by David Fagerberg, Stefano Parenti, and David Kennedy, which relate to liturgy, and a joy to present them here to you. In the first chapter, Professor David Fagerberg, Professor Emeritus at Notre Dame University, examines the definition of a rite and acknowledges the problematic cliché of honor and respect for the venerable ancient traditions of the Christian East. And I quote him, "We think we admire Eastern Catholic churches for the antiquity of their liturgies or for the diversity of their rites as churches sui juris. But," Fagerberg argues that, and I continue the quotation, "we are actually admiring the integration of their liturgy, theology, spirituality, and discipline in making up the inheritance of the lived faith of a distinct Christian people." End of quote. This holistic, new approach has as its purpose not simply the study of Eastern Catholic theology or an experience of Eastern Catholic liturgy, but its goal is to help each man and woman come before the living God, to thirst for him, to hope in him, to hear his voice, and to cry out to him. Here we have Fagerberg at his finest. The second chapter, my own contribution on the liturgical theology of church singing, takes as its point of departure the pastoral letter of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky from April 1941, published during the Soviet occupation of his archieparchy, right before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The text of the pastoral letter was translated in English by Peter Galadza in his monograph on Sheptytsky, published in Orientalia Christiana Analecta, which was the first serious engagement with Sheptytsky's theological writing and liturgical activity. That Metropolitan Andrei should dedicate a pastoral letter addressed to his faithful on the theological importance of singing in Christian worship, which he calls an augmentation of the gospel proclamation and its relation to the spiritual life, during one of the most horrific and barbaric periods of the 20th century, when his own clergy and faithful were being martyred before his very eyes, deserves greater attention. Since Father Peter Galadza is singled out as a member of the Schmemann, Kavanaugh, Fagerberg, Galadza School of Liturgical Theology in Father Andrew Louth's book Modern Orthodox Thinkers, which itself uses the Philokalia as a common thread in framing 19th and 20th century Orthodox theological reflection, in my contribution, I then analyze the texts of the Philokalia for what they have to say about church singing, with implications for bishops and priests in the way they lead the church, not just the singing. The third chapter, by the Reverend Father and Professor Stefano Parenti, Professore Ordinario at Sant'Anselmo, and often present here as a relatore of various doctoral theses defended over the last few years. In this chapter, Parenti offers an analysis of the atemporal hermeneutic of antiquity promoted by Catholic magisterial documents, which is not viable and often misapplied in the life of the Church today. Taking Byzantine Rite liturgical books and the concept of an editio typica and the recensio rutena of the Greek Catholic churches in Eastern Europe as a case study, Parenti points out various ways in which texts promulgated by the Holy See, both before and after the Second Vatican Council, how these books contradict Vatican II doctrines regarding the sacraments and demonstrate a codified conflict between the lex orandi and the lex credendi. In the end, Parenti asks, who's really in charge in modifying and correcting liturgical texts? Although he doesn't answer the question, excusing himself as it is outside his competence as a historian of liturgy, so he says, he does give various helpful insights on solutions and proposals to various contemporary problems. This will certainly be a chapter of the book worth reading for those who work in Via Conciliazione, if I dare say. The fourth chapter, on the diaconate, by Protodeacon David Kennedy from St. Elias Church in Brampton, Ontario, presents the current teachings on diaconal service from Orientalium Ecclesiarum, Lumen Gentium, and the 1996 instruction, pointing out that, quote, attempts by local Eastern Catholic hierarchs to uncritically imitate the restoration of the diaconate in the Roman Church has resulted in adopting educational and pastoral paradigms that are not in coherence with the theology, liturgy, spirituality, and canonical traditions of their own churches, end quote. In many cases, diaconal service has either been reduced to a liturgical function that could be carried out even by a priest, quote unquote, playing the part of a deacon, or augmented, allowing Eastern deacons to do things that a deacon cannot do in the East, like bless or preside at liturgical services. With 80% of Eastern Catholic deacons currently residing outside the traditional homelands of their churches, in the so-called diaspora, this is both a challenge and an opportunity for the order and ministry of the diaconate. Finally, it is a joy to read the concluding chapters of this volume, written from three different perspectives: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Eastern Catholic. From the Western perspective, the Roman Catholic expert on non-Chalcedonian Christianity, Robin Darling-Young, herself a member of the Vatican's Theological Commission and an expert of Armenian and Syriac Christianity, writes of her first experience of Eastern Christian liturgy, which was at St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral in Chicago. Following other women from the West who journey to the East, such as Melania, Egeria, and others. Her insights on mystery and martyria help people in the East appreciate overlooked or ignored details that are essential, but often taken for granted. From the Orthodox perspective, Father Andrew Louth, emeritus professor of Durham and Oxford, a priest of the Moscow Patriarchate, and arguably the foremost living expert of Orthodox theology today, notes that he is, quote, colorblind and sees no difference when reading an Eastern Catholic or Orthodox writing on liturgical theology. And I must add that at the end of the Divine Liturgy, during a visit to Father Andrew Louth's parish in Durham, England, in September of 2019, Father Andrew gave one of the best definitions of an Eastern Catholic Church that I've ever heard. This was given to his parishioners after the liturgy in introducing various guests at the service. And he said, "They are in all ways Orthodox and similar to us, except that they have anticipated the union of the churches for which we pray at every divine liturgy." And from a pastoral perspective, Metropolitan Boris Gudziak of Philadelphia, who is no stranger to this Aula Magna, reflects on the application of decades of theological study in the future of the Eastern Catholic churches, particularly the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. This book, and particularly its engagement with Orthodox scholars, shows how different the study of Eastern Catholic theology can be when it is approached by renowned professors, Harvard-educated scholars, and English or British gentlemen, instead of trying to engage in dialogue with KGB-vetted, if not trained, clerics, as has happened in the past, in the era dominated by Ostpolitik. An interest in Eastern Catholic theology, manifested in its authentic liturgical, spiritual, and canonical heritage, is a refreshing change to an exaggerated interest in church politics or culture that has often characterized it in the past. Despite all this joy, there's an aspect of sadness in all this for me, namely that Father Peter Galadza is not here with us now to share his own response. But, God willing, we can leave that to next time, and I'm told he's watching on YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for their insight and reflections. We'd now like to invite our respondents. Professor Thomas Catoy will respond first. He holds the William and Barbara Moran Chair in Early Christian Theology and Interreligious Relations at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas Angelicum. His main areas of research are early Christian theology and spirituality, with a particular interest in the post-Chalcedonian period, Orthodox theology, and interreligious dialogue, focusing on the conversation between Eastern Christianity and Buddhism. From 2006 to 2024, Professor Catoy taught at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University and the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He received his doctorate in theology from Boston College. Welcome, Professor Catoy.
Thank you. Allora, prima di incominciare vorrei naturalmente ringraziare l'Università Orientale, l'Istituto Szeptycki e soprattutto il Padre Galadza per l'invito a partecipare a questo incontro. Tuttavia io ho scelto di presentare la mia riflessione in lingua inglese. So, before I begin my reflection, I'd like to say that I come to this material as a lay theologian and as a Latin Rite Catholic who has been, let's say, nurtured and enriched for now more than 20 years, I would say 25 years, by my encounter with Eastern Christian theology in general and Eastern Catholic theology in particular. And of course, I should also say Eastern Catholic spirituality. In pre-war days, I also had the wonderful opportunity to be a visiting professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and meet with Father Gudziak, which was also an extraordinary experience. So now I'd like to reflect very briefly, I was told I have about 10 minutes, on the contribution that Eastern Catholic theology can offer to the Universal Church at this time in history. And I was particularly impressed by the essays in the second part of the volume, which tried to explore the close relationships between patristic theology and spirituality, try to map it out. And Khaled Anatolius, for instance, reflects on the legacy of Athanasius of Alexandria and the call to Christian unity. And Andrew Hayes talks about the way in which St. Ephraim, a Syriac theologian, shaped the practice of Eastern Catholic theology. Now, in the introduction, the editors talk about the way the particular has always to be in service of the universal. And I think these two essays articulate how this trajectory actually unfolds. So I think all of us here are sort of interested in this sort of basic question: what is the contribution that the Eastern Catholic churches and Eastern Catholic theology in general can offer to the universal church today? So I'd like to organize my thoughts on the three claims. Number one is that Eastern Catholic theology can offer the universal church what I would call a sort of metaphysical supplementation, a reminder of the broader metaphysically grounded character of the Christian claim to truth, something that unfortunately I believe is often lost in contemporary Catholic practice, if perhaps not necessarily Catholic theology in theory. That's number one. Now, number two, Eastern Catholic theology can help the universal church recover the experiential character of the Christian doctrines that we have inherited from the past, the fact that they actually emerge out of a spiritual experience, against the criticism that is often leveled against classical theology, that traditional Trinitarian or Christological doctrine is no longer relevant for Christians today. And then number three, finally, I'd like to point out to argue that the Eastern Catholic tradition can remind us of the fact that the theology, to use categories that need rescuing from the realm of cliché, is always inextricably linked with spiritual practice. So we have three factors, and I think these three factors, or these three perspectives, can illumine the relevance not of just one particular Eastern Catholic church, but of all of them. And it occurred to me that in a way what we are doing here is actually something that everybody is always talking about in a lot of academic contexts nowadays, which is contextual theology. Though alas, many of the most vocal supporters of this methodology often show very little interest for Eastern Catholic tradition. Perhaps Eastern Catholics come from the wrong context, I don't know. Anyway, Khaled Anatolius' reflection on Athanasius, so to go back to point one of the 3 points, resumes a very protracted engagement that this scholar has carried out with the thought of this father, which started more than 20 years ago with his monograph on Athanasius, the coherence of his thought. And in that work, which is already from the late 90s, Anatolius claimed that the organizing principles of Athanasius' thought was the notion of creation. The eternal Logos is the linchpin of the natural order, as well as the one who mediates between the unity of the eternal Father and the plurality of creation in all its difference and contingency. His incarnation reflects the need to prevent the work of his hands from being dissolved into nothingness by sin. Nothingness is set up as the foil of being. In a cosmic drama that caught the attention of John Henry Newman and made him re-evaluate the shape and purpose of the Church's doctrinal legacy. Now, the notion of the atonement is this notion of the atonement in Athanasius is very distant from the vision of Anselm, for whom the Son of God has to offer himself as a propitiatory victim to appease the Father's wrath, in a kind of cosmic transaction whose fruits have to be reaped by individual Christians through the practice of the sacraments. This Anselmian paradigm and its later Calvinist rendition have for centuries served as the framework of reference for the theology of the atonement, relegating the Athanasian approach to the pages of the patristic manuals. But I believe the two do not even have to be incompatible with each other. The sweeping Christocentric vision of Athanasius and his teaching of the Logos Spermatikoi can perhaps balance the Western tendency to understand the reconciliation with the Father in an exceedingly transactional or extrinsic way. The incarnation changes our very being from the inside and does not merely offer us an extrinsic gift. So the fact that the Eastern churches have always consistently foregrounded these pre-Anselmian theologies can go a long way to redress the existing soteriological imbalance. That's just an example, from point one. Now, if we turn to the second point, the experiential character of theology, we must acknowledge, I think, that a lot of Western theology still suffers in the aftermath of certain critiques, such as Schleiermacher's critique in the Christian faith. Because if you look at what Schleiermacher says there about classical Christology and Trinitarian theology, well, it's not particularly pleasant, because Schleiermacher remonstrates constantly against the Christological and Trinitarian heritage of the first councils, claiming that it is ultimately not really very useful for our spiritual practice. And if we set out to correlate his teachings with our experience, he claims, we will soon enough that in most cases these Christology and these Trinitarian theologies don't really have anything to tell us. He then says that the teaching of the communication of the idioms, for instance, is something that has no bearing for our own inner life. He just dismisses it in a few sentences, like something like that. And he says, well, what does that have to do with our feeling of absolute dependence? Certainly nothing. So if you want to promote your Abhängigkeitsgefühl from God, you may have to look elsewhere from, rather than studying Nicaea or Chalcedon. Now, the problem is, the reality, alas, is that Schleiermacher seems to be blind to the fact that the Christology of Nicaea and Chalcedon, both of them, these Christologies plural, do actually have experiential roots. They are an articulation of a particular experience of salvation. Now, the Canadian theologian Bernard Lonergan would say that these are judgments, or really communitarian judgments of experiences that have already gone through the sieve of different individual judgments. So then you have a plurality of judgments, you have to come up with some kind of meta-judgment, but the ground, the root, the starting point is always an experience. So in articulating the dynamic of our salvation in metaphysical terms, these doctrinal definitions, such as Nicaea or Chalcedon, are not obstacles to genuine experience, which is what Schleiermacher seems to contend. But actually, these definitions encapsulate the original experience of the Christians of the first few centuries. So, proposing these theologies anew to our consideration, the Eastern Catholic Churches witness to their experiential character or root and can counter the contemporary tendency to view them as arbitrary and therefore as something that has to be overcome. That was number 2. Now, finally, if we think about the interface of early Christian theology and spiritual practice, we may recall what already in 2001 Sarah Coakley had said in her article on the Chalcedonian definition and on what this definition did and did not say. Now, if we read early Christian dogma in a naive ontological way, as if, doctrines just describe stuff which is out there, or conversely turned it into a pure linguistic assertion so that dogmas are just guidelines to find our way towards God, or perhaps we just view it as a metaphor because we don't really know what else to do, we completely miss the point, because these dogmas, not just Chalcedon but all other ones, they are analogical articulations of a reality that we can touch, apprehend, and experience in our own spiritual lives. The Chalcedonian horos is thus a horizon which determines not just the institutional boundaries of the church, but also its doctrinal reach. And yet this is a horizon, yet a horizon is a reality that moves with us as we progress. Thus, we should be invited to contemplate this horizon ever anew as to constantly grow towards it. Now, this point, of course, is connected with the second one about the experiential ground of the doctrines, but perhaps it is even more crucial today as many theological institutions seem to operate under a self-imposed artificial dichotomy between historical and, again, contextual theology, where the assumption is that this historical theology cannot really guide us to a deeper experience of God because it's so remote from our own location. I think the Eastern Catholic Churches can help us rediscover that, well, all theology is contextual and that even the legacy of the early churches can contribute to the spiritual renewal of the broad universal church. Now, I guess to conclude very briefly, I was also very struck by Laut's discussion, the chapter that Father Galazza already discussed, and by his observation that perhaps Eastern Catholic churches have less of a, he actually says that, hang up about Western churches than the Orthodox churches, so they don't have to sit around wondering whether we actually have to be anti-Western all the time. Now, our challenge now is so that the challenge of the universal church is to rediscover the complementarity as opposed to the opposition between the Latin and the Eastern Catholic theological tradition. And I think that this volume goes quite a long way in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Archbishop Michel Jalach to respond. He is titular Archbishop of Nisibis de Maronite and a religious of the Antonine Maronite Order, and has served as Secretary of the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches since 2023. Prior to his appointment to the Dicastery as Secretary, Archbishop Jalach was Rector of the Antonine University in Lebanon and a Professor of Ecclesiology and Ecumenical Studies. He holds a doctorate in ecclesiology from the Pontifical Oriental Institute and is author of the book Ecclesiology, Ecclesiological Identity of the Eastern Catholic Churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum 30 and Beyond. He also served as Secretary General of the Middle East Council of Churches. He is a consultor to the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity and a member of the St. Irenaeus Joint International Catholic Orthodox Working Group. His research interests include the role of Eastern Christianity and ecumenism, especially in the Middle East. Welcome, Archbishop Jalak.
Grazie. Caro Preside, cari professori e studenti, ringrazio per l'invito anzitutto rivoltomi e sono lieto e onorato di sottolineare alcuni aspetti dopo gli interventi degli illustri professori che mi hanno preceduto. Il volume che abbiamo presentato arriva, a mio avviso, al momento giusto. Oserei dire che giunge agli albori della pienezza del tempo per le chiese orientali cattoliche. Mi spiego. Se ci è voluto più di mezzo secolo nel periodo precedente al Vaticano II per poter lentamente de-eretizzare o de-scismatizzare gli ortodossi e giungere all'unitatis redintegratio, così sono stati necessari altri decenni per demostruosizzare ecclesiologicamente gli orientali cattolici, per accettarli nella loro specificità, riconoscendo finalmente che non sono loro l'ostacolo all'unità della Chiesa, ma bensì molti altri fattori, spesso esterni alla loro volontà. Qui forse bisogna spiegare un attimo che per un certo periodo queste chiese si chiamavano, ecclesiologicamente un mostro ecclesiologico. Poi si è addolcito dicendo che ecclesiologicamente sono anomale queste chiese. L'intento dei curatori è lodevole: creare un forum scientifico dove studiosi delle diverse tradizioni orientali possono incontrarsi, conoscersi e confrontarsi sul piano accademico. Sono certo che al momento opportuno anche ortodossi vi prenderanno parte per esprimere il loro punto di vista, soprattutto su temi comuni come il primato e l'interazione con l'Occidente cristiano. Forse esagero a dirlo, ma forum liberi come questo potrebbero, nello stato attuale, contribuire alla causa ecumenica più delle commissioni ufficiali, spesso vincolate da posizioni istituzionali. Uno spazio come questa piattaforma non mancherà di stimolare elementi, favorendo il meglio di ciascuno e promuovendo la causa ecumenica diversamente. La ricca diversità delle chiese orientali cattoliche è al tempo una benedizione e una sfida. È difficile inquadrarla dentro una sola categoria confessionale. Questo la rende complessa da comprendere per un mondo latino tendenzialmente più omogeneo. Posso testimoniare dalla mia esperienza in Curia. Ogni questione riguardante l'Oriente viene automaticamente inviata al nostro dicastero, quasi a dire: occupatevene voi, noi non ci capiamo nulla, come se l'Oriente fosse un enigma irrisolvibile o un labirinto da evitare. Occorre al contempo abbandonare alcuni cliché, come quello secondo cui gli orientali cattolici sarebbero il ponte tra Oriente e Occidente. Era una formula utile all'inizio del percorso ecumenico. Oggi però rischia di apparire vuota. Il ruolo delle Chiese Unite non è quello di essere strumentali a qualcosa. Questo ruolo non debba essere necessariamente funzionale. Noi non esistiamo per mediare, ma per partecipare pienamente alla vita e alla teologia della Chiesa universale cattolica, portando la nostra esperienza e storia, il nostro modo di pensare, come anche la nostra propria vita ecclesiale. Riguardo agli orientali cattolici in Occidente, professor Avakumov ha enfatizzato il ruolo del modernizzare le chiese orientali. Si tratta di un concetto difficilmente accettabile, almeno in questi termini. Ritengo che l'espressione progresso organico sia il binomio più adatto per esprimere questo concetto. Se è vero che come orientali cattolici abbiamo il diritto di sviluppare un pensiero teologico proprio, è altrettanto vero che conviene evitare ciò che urta inutilmente la sensibilità degli ortodossi o compromettere il dialogo e le relazioni ecumeniche, soprattutto quando non è strettamente necessario. Un altro tema su cui si è voluto porre l'accento nel libro è quello dei martiri orientali cattolici e l'alto tributo pagato per l'unità. È certamente un tema meritevole, ma anche lì occorre fare attenzione a non scivolare nella strumentalizzazione della santità. Un'enfasi eccessiva rischia di irrigidire le posizioni. Si potrebbe invece cercare di rileggere la vita e il pensiero di questi martiri adottando l'ermeneutica come chiave di lettura fondamentale per capire il contesto. E perché no? Insieme agli stessi ortodossi delle chiese coinvolte. E qui mi permetto anche di dare un esempio proprio fresco di oggi. Mi sono permesso, di dire, ho chiesto il permesso al prefetto e me l'ha detto sì, si può dire. Oggi stesso è uscito il decreto per i santi, i nuovi santi da essere santificati. Tra questi lista, cioè vedete oggi il bollettino di oggi stesso, figura un arcivescovo armeno. Bene, un arcivescovo Maloyan. Non era solo un solo armeno, erano due armeni. E il secondo armeno è un martire, ed è una cosa, però un martire che c'è per istigazione ortodossa nella storia e chissà forse anche del patriarca ortodosso, non voglio adesso dire chi è e tutto, però per dire che c'è stato un intervento anche degli ortodossi che ha condotto questo, sacerdote al martirio. Però andiamo a vedere un po' il contesto ermeneutico, il contesto storico di quella cosa. Chissà, il patriarca stesso era quasi un agente dell'impero ottomano e quindi più agente che deve raccogliere la jizya per il sultano ottomano che un patriarca nel nostro modo di vedere le cose. Quindi anche la questione dei martiri dipende dal contesto e dipende anche dal modo di vedere. E per questo io consiglio di studiare questo e ci sono anche molti ortodossi che sono disponibili a studiare la questione, storica insieme. Qui passo a un altro tema congenito agli orientali cattolici, di cui si è parlato anche quello dell'unità. Essi hanno una predisposizione naturale, secondo me, all'unità. La loro stessa esistenza vive la tensione verso l'unità in modo del tutto naturale rispetto alle altre comunità ecclesiali. Queste chiese rappresentano la prova tangibile che la fedeltà a Roma è conciliabile con una fedeltà senza compromessi a tutto al patrimonio spirituale dell'Oriente. È proprio questa realtà che ha portato per lungo tempo gli ortodossi a guardare con sospetto il loro impegno di conciliazione, vedendo in loro un simbolo della prepotenza latina e di un tradimento nei confronti dell'Oriente. I cattolici uniti vivono non una sola tensione, ma doppia tensione rispetto all'Oriente e all'Occidente. Questa tensione, tuttavia, è da considerarsi un motivo di vanto ecclesiologico. Grazie a loro, infatti, si è potuto mantenere viva la coscienza dell'anomalia della divisione, non la loro anomalia, è la divisione che è anomala, sopportando su di sé incomprensioni e i mutamenti della storia. Hanno detto bene i due curatori del libro, del volume, quando scrivono: After all, who more than Eastern Catholics know the pains of disunity, the misunderstandings of both Western and Eastern Christians, and the double call that arises from such division. Le chiese orientali cattoliche hanno inoltre maturato un senso di discernimento non comune. Sono chiese che hanno sperimentato sulla propria pelle la tensione della comunione e possiedono un'esperienza di considerevole valore per la Chiesa intera. A differenza di molti, esse sanno che non tutto ciò che fu acquisito nella comunità e nella comunione è da ripudiare, così come non tutto ciò che è stato recepito dalla teologia latina è intoccabile. Complimenti dunque per questa iniziativa, che considererò anche più importante se verrà adeguatamente sviluppata per raggiungere anche l'ambiente della curia romana. È qui che Petra ha parlato bene di questa cosa. C'è una teologia che prende in considerazione l'Oriente cattolico, capace di contribuire qualitativamente all'arricchimento dei documenti del Magistero in modo che mostrino maggiore sensibilità nei confronti delle chiese orientali cattoliche nell'elaborazione dei testi. E qui posso dare un esempio anche concreto recentissimo. Infatti Padre Daniel c'era nella commissione liturgica. Infatti ci ha proposto il prefetto, era nella commissione, diciamo, interdicasteriale, e si parlava dei sacramenti e si diceva, cioè si è posto la domanda: cosa rende valido per gli orientali cattolici un sacramento a prescindere dal linguaggio scolastico latino? Hanno qualcosa da dire sulla validità di un sacramento? Se non vogliono usare la stessa terminologia latina? E qui una proposta è una pista veramente grande, ed è vero, difficilmente si può rispondere in modo del tutto orientale cattolico. Concludo. È vero che l'Eastern Catholic Theology in Action arriva 4 anni dopo il pensionamento per onorare un professore speciale e un teologo distinto, oltre che padre del nostro caro amico e collaboratore Daniel. Ma è altrettanto vero che valeva la pena aspettare 4 anni per offrire un bouquet di studi all'altezza del meritevole onorato. Grazie.
Thank you, Archbishop Jalak. Ora iniziamo con le domande da parte di tutti i presenti. Se volete fare una domanda ai relatori, vi chiedo di alzare la mano e verrà il padre Cyril Pinchak con il microfono. Chiediamo piuttosto le domande e non dei lunghi commenti, così ci sarà più opportunità per la partecipazione. Nel frattempo, come ci organizziamo con le domande, forse i relatori vogliono commentare, rispondere ai rispondenti a qualcosa che hanno detto.
Avete detto non dire un commento, ma io voglio cominciare proprio con un commento. Nel giorno, quando poster di questo evento è stato esposto qui nel corridoio era una persona che è subito venuta da me, che sono stato anche nel corridoio, con non posso dire con una intenzione troppo buona, dicendo: ma come si può parlare di Eastern Catholic Theology? Questo è only Greek Catholic Theology, soltanto bizantini sono qui, dove sono altri? Era una ironia. Ma io mi davvero chiedo, ok, io ho detto, ma nessuno non impedisce anche altri di sviluppare, nessuno non impedisce o caldei o copti o etiopici o armeni cattolici di presentare questa bellezza teologica nei libri e presentare e completare questa Eastern Catholic Theology. E questo è un commento, ma anche ma davvero qualcosa manca in questa tradizione. Abbiamo tante cose, abbiamo tante bellezze delle queste chiese orientali, ma dove sono teologi da davvero presentare all'Occidente questa bellezza di teologia, non soltanto che così che non hanno questi che fanno sempre commenti perché solo bizantini, ma dove sono altri?
Sì, posso rispondere io? Sì, è vero, predomina questa visione dal rito bizantino, dalla Chiesa greco-cattolica. Ovviamente è il rito più praticato tra le chiese apostoliche, dopo il rito latino. Ovviamente non vogliamo corre il rischio di armonizzare tutte le visioni di tutte le chiese orientali, ma non è del tutto vero. Abbiamo un bel contributo di Andrew Hayes su Efrem di Siro, sì. E lui dà questa visione siriaca, dà una visione per tutta la Chiesa cattolica, sta qui. Anche Robin Darling Young, che è un amatore della Chiesa orientali cattoliche, parla così bene della tradizione siriaca e amena che ci sta. Io sono molto contento che quando abbiamo fatto il primo presentazione del libro a San Diego, il secondo volume di questa collana è un libro di preghiera tradotto dal caldeo in inglese, così che questa chiesa caldea statunitense può fiorire al di là di questa prima immigrazione. Come diceva padre Alexander Lashchuk, iniziano subito a tradurre in inglese così che la seconda generazione, la terza generazione può pregare nella propria lingua e che questa preghiera può avere un impatto su quelli che non capiscono caldeo. Un polacco americano può sperimentare il Cristo tramite questa traduzione. Quindi questa collana inizia questo processo di allargare lo spazio per tutte queste voci. Sì, non so se... Series editor.
Sì, no, è una osservazione giusta, però anche si può pensare della terminologia del codice delle chiese orientali, che 1 per 23 chiese, quale tradizione rispecchia? Allora, la terminologia è sempre problematica, anche vari discorsi dei papi, per esempio l'Oriente, ma cosa intende? Molto spesso qualcosa dalla scuola di Parigi, Émigré russe, che è molto bello, però non rispecchia tutto l'Oriente, è così. Words are words and things are things, sì, però una sfida. Sì, sono d'accordo che c'è tanto spazio, anche questo commento può cominciare un dialogo, può cominciare a pianificare il secondo volume su Eastern Catholic Theology dal punto di vista siro-orientale, che mi dicono anche questa terminologia non piace ai caldei o siro-malabaresi, ma comunque.
Posso dire una cosa? Ai tempi di Giovanni Paolo II il linguaggio più comune era quello dei due polmoni. Forse vi ricorderete, era l'immagine più comune, il polmone occidentale, il polmone orientale, e spesso era il polmone inteso in rapporto alla grecità, la tradizione greca. Ma contemporaneamente è emerso sempre di più anche il linguaggio dei 3 polmoni e dei più polmoni, a partire specialmente dal polmone siriaco. Io l'ho visto a livello dei miei studenti siriaci, che abbiamo cominciato a parlare del terzo polmone siriaco dal punto di vista della testimonianza morale. E secondo me è bene che tutti questi polmoni vengano fuori e si manifestino, perché è tutto considerato, se si crea il contesto, poi anche i teologi, tutti i teologi orientali, diciamo così, potranno vivere di tutti questi polmoni e in qualche modo creare una teologia orientale unitaria, perché alla fine la teologia la fanno gli uomini, la fanno le persone, la fanno i cervelli, diciamo così, che unificano la loro esperienza, il loro sapere, prendendolo dalle varie fonti, dalle varie realtà. Noi aspettiamo, e devono sorgere, dei teologi orientali che partecipano di tutta la storia, della complessità della storia teologica, liturgica, orientale, e insieme anche di quella occidentale. Perché no? Perché in fondo ogni pensare teologico deve essere aperto alla totalità, non semplicemente parte e vive all'interno della propria tradizione, ma deve essere aperto, perché questo è il senso del pensare teologico in rapporto alla cattolicità della Chiesa. Scusate, sì.
Grazie. Un'altra domanda?
Sono Cindy Wooden from Catholic News Service. Father Leszek, those numbers are scary, but could you also talk a little bit about, I mean, the Eastern churches, like any church, being Christian, we are called to mission and to share the good news. And I know that the Eastern churches in North America, many of them are no longer simply made up of people from the ethnic group that originally founded those churches, but that they're growing. Is that an oddity, or is it something that is becoming a phenomenon?
So I think there's the great missionary potential of the Eastern churches that are offering something in North America that people are looking for and not finding. In my part of the world, be careful what I say because we're in Rome, but I'll say there's a crackdown on a certain liturgy that has sent certain people over to the Christian East in very large numbers, which is something we've seen in the past also. But for whatever reason, I know Father Andrew's parish is very diverse parish, and many of our parishes are very diverse with people who have become Eastern Christian because they find something there. Sometimes that's informally, and by that I mean they are Latin Catholics that we're glad to have, and they'll come every Sunday and help us pay our mortgages, but they remain kind of officially Latin Catholic. And sometimes they want to officially transfer and really become incorporated into this expression of the body of Christ. So I think there's a great opportunity there. In Canada especially, working with our Native brothers and sisters, we have found that it's often been that they're very open to in that part of the world, it's Byzantine Ukrainians for the most part, but they are very open to the Christian East because it speaks more to their traditional expressions of Native spirituality, especially the idea of having an elder who is married with children, so it really speaks to them culturally. And we have a mission in Winnipeg that maybe some of you have heard of called the Welcome Home, that is run by the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, the Redemptorists, who run a street mission in the Byzantine Rite that is primarily for native street people. And you know, they begin the evening with Vespers, and then every parish in the city of Winnipeg takes turn making dinner, and it's about bringing these families together in a faith-filled environment and bringing children off the streets where maybe they'll get into trouble. And there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of work. The challenge, of course, is that our parishes are often so small, and Father is just trying to not, to not lose everything, lose his people, lose his paycheck, whatever, that it doesn't leave a lot of time for this stuff, right? And we don't have maybe the resources that, of a lay pastoral associate or other people that we might have in the Latin parishes. But I would say that in general, we are seeing a great time of excitement. I was often thinking, Monsignor LaRusso has this great book, Eastern Faithful Latin Pastors. I want to write one the opposite of Latin faithful Eastern pastors, because I get so many calls from Eastern pastors who don't know what to do, like when a Latin family brings their kid for confirmation in the Byzantine parish, and these kind of questions that are a different kind of pastoral challenge that we haven't really seen addressed a lot. And that's just reflecting this thing that the Christian East, I think, has something to offer. People are looking for it. Now, whether that's going to statistically rebound the numbers we see, I don't think so. But I think there is something there, and that's great.
Cindy, that was the great question, because they are fearful statistics. But what's more gruesome is the fact that those big numbers were probably artificially inflated in the first place. So it creates a drastic drop-off when you see the current status. That's not to say that we have many successes to be grateful for as an Eastern Catholic Church in the West. I think the Sheptytsky Institute is a certain great light, but we have many failures. We can all learn from our failures as well. However, one of the things that we're seeing, we ran one of our priests who gathered the entire Ruthenian Church in the United States together for an assembly in New Jersey 2 years ago. We're going to do it again in Whiting, Indiana. We ran a study with young adults from across the Ruthenian Byzantine Catholic metropolia, and there's a groundswell of young adults that are not just running from hostile ecclesial environments, but are joining in very large numbers our church, particularly in metropolitan areas. New York, Minneapolis, LA, Chicago, Spokane, Washington, Seattle, Washington, Houston, Dallas. I can start rattling them off. Unprecedented numbers. When you start surveying these people, they're looking for two things. They're looking for authentic worship, and this was the surprising thing for me, an intergenerational experience. Right? The very thing that we think would be unattractive to young people as a church full of old people is the very thing that people are running towards, because they don't have any structures in their own lives that can provide mentorship or interfacing with the prior generation. Right? Their grandmother and grandfather are in old folks' homes and maybe across the country because they had to move for work. But here, they can engage with a wider palette of humanity than their own peers and actually learn something. Yeah? So it's a fantastic opportunity that we're seeing happening before our eyes, not with our help. I don't think we're doing a great job, but nevertheless, even in our more flaccid evangelical posture, they're still coming to us. Right? It's a very beautiful thing to see. So numbers are quite terrible. They're not capturing everything. And one of the things is Canada's just as wide as the United States. And this fervent return to the faith that's happening, we have Pew Research studies that are showing for the first time an uptick in religious affiliation of young people ages 18 to 39, then decline. And we're experiencing that too. But again, it's more perceptible in these large metropolitan areas where you got people moving to there. It's going to be less perceptible in a place where they're moving from, like Northeast PA. So all the more reason to gather us in some capacity to see a critical mass.
I'd like to piggyback on Cindy's question because it pertains to what you had said in your presentation, Father Alex. This idea of Eastern Christians, the very real possibility that this could lead to some form of extinction because of the mass assimilation. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would have any idea at the base level, just kind of at the entry level, what can we suggest, what could you suggest as a pastoral response to try to mitigate that? What do you think would be a good response from our Roman Catholic priests, bishops, faithful, when they encounter an Eastern Christian who perhaps is coming to an area where there isn't an Eastern Catholic church?
Scusate, io devo andare. Buona continuazione a tutti.
Grazie, Padre.
I think that there's a great thing to recognize that we have to do what we can to support, at every one of our parishes in North America at least, there are probably some Eastern faithful there, right? And to support them somehow in their journey, and whether that means that when they want their child baptized, finding a Syro-Malabar priest who can come to town that summer to do the baptism, or helping them find resources, or at least when it's the Catholic school and it's grade 8, that we don't exclude the child in some way because he's Eastern and already chrismated. There are a lot of delicate things that can avoid the children, which of course will be the future, from feeling that they're weird, right? That they're weird and there's something wrong with them. And I think that that's the real pastoral challenge. You know, like, why is it a delict in the Eastern Code to induce someone to transfer rights, right? Like, it's the point where we say it's a canonical crime and you should be punished, right? Which is a pretty strong step. And I think some of our local churches are very supportive of that. Often it's even just pastor to pastor. Others are just happy to have the bodies, right? And so it's a very delicate question, you know. I would say maybe even we deal with formation of candidates for ministry, and you know, there are lots of candidates for ministry that we probably all encountered who have no Eastern formation of any kind, right? Which is, I say that's a problem, right? That's a problem.
Other question from the floor?
So one question that sort of came to mind when you were talking about ascription, and that very nice quote from John Paul II, which apparently he cribbed from Zizek, maybe he, and but also this question of assimilation, and one of the things that often occurs to me in my reflection on these themes is that maybe what we're missing is the question of how ascription is handed on through the family. And that allows perhaps for a thicker reflection on the family as a domestic church, that there's an ecclesiality to that. Anyway, so that's just one theme that sort of came to mind, but not to leave this as a comment. What direction do you see the series going on? Is it going to be thematic, or you know, individual monographs like the translation that by Father Yunan, or just sort of general questions for the editors? Thank you.
Do you know of these volumes? I know a little bit of them too, but yeah.
I think they're open to various possible publications because it's studies and texts. And the series editor, Father Yuri Avakumov, is his specialization is particularly in the period of the 11th, 12th century, these debates and conflicts between East and West. And then several of his doctoral students, I think, at Notre Dame have worked on the period around the Union Councils. And so there's an interest in looking at some of these texts, either monographs or translations and editions of texts that are quite neglected, or other periods before the 19th and 20th centuries that fall through the cracks very often in a scholarly approach. I don't recall, I should know the what's in the pipeline, but I'd have to get back to you.
There's translations of Cardinal Schlippy's journals coming. Again, there's a series of translations of a prayer book in Chaldean, really the first of its kind. And that same person who's just as engaged as translating Chaldean into English is really the only priest that's still teaching Chaldean functionally in the United States. So he's trying to keep both worlds together. So it's a big box into which you can put many things. But the ascription question is interesting. Particularly, you know, I have a lot of change of rights happening, mostly because I have unchurched people. I have, you know, a lot of people who just haven't been to church, and all of a sudden they start going to church. This is their home. We want to make sure we can take care of them, so we're trying to find them a way to spiritually guide them, and that's where ascription is not just paperwork, but is a spiritual thing.
Yeah, I think it's trying to integrate them into they want to be part of your parish, and you tell them, well, you're not really part of our parish, right? And you can't be on parish council, and you can't do this, and you can't do that, I think is the wrong message to send sometimes, right? So we need to figure out a way around that.
One question for the panelists as well. You know, very often when we think of the Eastern Catholic churches, at least in the diaspora, we often think of them, or they are practically very often have been, inward-looking, kind of little ethnic enclaves in and of themselves. And yet, you spoke today about the missionary activity of the Eastern churches. So I was hoping you can speak to that. Have the Eastern Catholic parishes in North America, in the diaspora, become more missionary, and how? What are the fruits of that? And I would add, what are some of the obstacles or challenges that they have to overcome to become missionary communities, take on that missionary call?
I think one of the respondents, Thomas Cato, mentioned the contextual approach. And if you think about all these Eastern Catholic churches, they're coming from areas where very often they were either persecuted or a minority, and I think almost none of them were kind of like a church of the state. Maybe the only one that comes to mind is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is like the golden era for Greek Catholics, you could say. And so shifting gears from a place where you might be a majority, but you're not connected with any kind of decision-making in your state. You're fighting for survival very often that is connected to preserving a language very often, and coming to a completely new context, especially after the Second Vatican Council, where you're confronting various challenges, assimilation, cultural, linguistic, things like that. I think all of these churches, there's various factors to consider and various backgrounds. The article by Stefano Parenti, I think, it does a good summary of the various contexts, and that each church has its own history, but definitely the New World offers very many possibilities, and it's ironic that some of the most, if you're looking for the most traditional Eastern Catholic liturgy, sometimes you find it in North America and not in Europe or the Middle East, which then causes many conflicts in various synods. So it's just something to keep in mind in all this.
The most successful Eastern Catholic pastor in the United States has to be of thrice blessed memory, Father Joseph Francavilla. He was pastor of Holy Transfiguration Melkite Catholic Church in McLean, Virginia, which is a suburb of D.C. And after I was shortly named pastor of St. Mary's Byzantine Catholic Church in Whiting, Indiana, I called the guy who I thought was an expert in the subject, and the first thing he told me, he says, you got to be the weirdest thing possible so that they'll pass up all of the other more convenient options along the way, which he has to do. And in McLean, when traffic is horrid because you're in the district, what's going to bind them together? That's not just being a gourmet option that's tasty and attractive. It's actually something that Flannery O'Connor says when she's a Southern Catholic writer, writes really weird stories, very infused with Catholic sensibility. And they said, why do you choose these really awful, ugly figures in the subject of your short stories? She's like, for the deaf you have to shout, and for the blind you have to draw large, startling pictures, right? That's something I think that the Eastern churches are very good at, not just because we have frightening, scary Christs on our ceiling, but the fact that we sort of boldly proclaim, I think what Thomas said, this wider metaphysical universe into which we are situated that people are otherwise blind to. And when you do that healthily, you find yourself in a great evangelical place. I think I inherited, I'm a second-generation professor at the Sheptytsky Institute, but one of the things that I can speak to is when it was in Ottawa, the amount of conversions that took place through the chaplaincy, right? The amount of conversions. It's a book, Strangers in a Strange Church, right? Precisely because these professors had the courage to be themselves, which is authentically Christian, in their native habitat and offer a hospitable place for others. It's a tremendous, powerful thing that I think we have at our disposal when we want to cultivate it.
Thank you. On that note, I would like to thank our panelists and our respondents for such an engaging discussion on contemporary Eastern Catholic theology. We will have the pleasure and the opportunity, actually, to continue this conversation this summer when we will welcome Archbishop Michel Jalak and Deacon Daniel Galadza to the United States for the North American Byzantine Catholic Assembly, July 17 to 20, which promises to be a vibrant gathering of Byzantine Catholics in the diaspora. Catholic Near East Welfare Association will also continue its support of this significant conversation as Monsignor Peter Vaccari, president of this papal organization, will also be a key presenter at the assembly, hosted at Father Andrew Summerson's parish in Whiting, Indiana. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you then. Registration for the assembly actually opens tomorrow, so you can find more information about that at byzantineassembly.org. I also encourage you to learn more about the co-sponsors of today's event, the Pontifical Oriental Institute, the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute, and Catholic Near East Welfare Association on their respective websites. Per chiudere vorrei ringraziare ancora i nostri relatori, i nostri rispondenti e tutti voi per la vostra partecipazione. Ora vorrei chiamare Padre Sani, il preside qui al Pio, di condividere qualche parola.
Dear esteemed guests, Your Grace, Monsignor Jalach, Michel Jalach, the organizers of this evening, this session, the speakers and respondents, professors and dear students. It was a pleasure to assist this session, and thank you very much for enlightening us to pose the question what the Eastern churches, how the Eastern churches can make themselves known. And I think this institute has a great role in answering that question. So I hope we will be able to do something in this mission of these churches. Thank you very much also for having chosen this institute to present this book. That was an honor to us, to the whole institution. And thank you very much once again. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Ora invito a tutti per un rinfresco offerto dall'Associazione per il benessere del Vicino Oriente fuori lì in corridoio. Grazie.